I've always said that if a game is fun, despite its flaws and despite its age, then by all means go ahead and play it. In other words, don't get hung up on the bad if it's outweighed by the good. Of course, what makes a game fun can be a little different for each of us. For me, fun generally means some combination of storytelling and challenge, which makes a game like Star Wars: The Old Republic a really curious case, and that's because the storytelling is absolutely S tier and the challenge, at least in the early game, is almost non-existent. Nevertheless, with fond memories of the former, I started getting back into this game a few months ago, around the time I heard that support for the game had been passed from BioWare to a caretaker. Realizing that I hadn't ever finished some of the class stories, but had really enjoyed the ones I did finish, I decided I should hurry up and start playing again before the game stopped being supported completely, and I lost the chance to experience those unfinished class stories firsthand. As a side note, I even started a campaign series on this channel called Storytelling at its Best. More on that in a minute. I think it's relevant to this discussion. All of that is a long-winded way of saying I think this game is still very enjoyable to play. It does, however, suffer from some very obvious flaws, and it has some absolute strengths that I believe are good enough to outweigh those defects, at least for me. I'll get into a little more detail on those strengths and weaknesses so that any of you who are on the fence about playing can have a little more information to make that decision, and maybe some of you who have played in the past but stopped doing it maybe will do the same thing that I've done and go back and try it again. First, the good. As I already said, SWTOR has some of the best storytelling in video game history. This comes as no surprise since it is a BioWare game. All the dialogue is fully voice acted, and the cinematics are plentiful, compelling, and professionally done. If you're someone like me and grew up loving the idea of being a Jedi Knight or a spaceship pilot, it's hard to find a better immersive experience than this. Many of the companions have fascinating personalities, backstories, and individual missions that make them come to life more than anything you'll likely find in a Bethesda RPG, for example. Please note that I love Bethesda games. I'm just saying the attention to detail, like voiced dialogues and companion relationships, are not as good as they are in SWTOR. One more really important point about the storytelling in SWTOR: the game is better than any other MMO I've ever played at making your quests feel logical, important, and part of a cohesive whole. Moreover, no game does a better job of making you feel important from the very beginning. Whether you're a Padawan having to rescue fully trained Jedis, or a new agent chasing mysterious forces before they can wreak untold damage on the capital world, you feel like someone who matters, is to be respected, and whose actions have real impact on the universe. All this from the very start of the game, even though you have lots and lots of room for improvement. The game has a full crafting system that isn't as pointless as it can be in some other MMOs, at least what I experienced back in my WoW days, for example. You certainly can get through most of the game using items you craft for yourself, made from materials you gathered for yourself. But whether you need to is another story, and I'll get into that in a minute. There is a housing system called Strongholds for those who are into that sort of thing. This is probably a good place to bring up a weird characteristic of SWTOR, and that is that it's an MMO, a massive multiplayer online game that plays more like a classic RPG. Yes, there are group missions you can do with others, there are guilds you can join or create, there is PvP, etc., but none of those are the strength of the game. I have no doubt that a group of friends can have a lot of fun socializing and doing group content in this game, but if you're not already invested in the game or just in love with the theme, it's more likely that you'll run through most of the stories with little interaction with any other players, other than seeing them clog up the central hubs between planetary missions. Anyway, there's nothing wrong with this dynamic. It's not unique to SWTOR that many players go through the content solo. I just think the parts of this game that shine push you in that direction more than any other MMO I've tried. There are lots of things to do in endgame, as usual, but I can't help but feel it's going to cater to the hardcore fans and not so much appeal to the typical player. For me, the added content was nice to have, or at least nice to see, but mostly irrelevant as I focused on the class missions and ultimately the DLC storylines because that's what was always the most compelling for me. So what about the flaws of the game? Keeping in mind that the game is over a decade old and was not exactly cutting edge even at the time of its launch, both its graphics and its combat is going to feel old by today's standards. I would not say the graphics are bad, it's never bad enough to be distracting, but there were moments where I lamented the lack of something better. One that stuck out for me is coming to the ship graveyard on Hoth, this snowy planet made famous in The Empire Strikes Back, bleak white landscapes everywhere, and then you pass through some mountains and come across a scene of many gigantic crashed spaceships littering a massive valley as far as the eye could see. I imagine seeing that in photorealistic graphics and can't help but be a little underwhelmed by what we get instead. Still, that's nitpicking. The combat is likewise sometimes underwhelming. It uses a tab targeting system directly borrowed from old-time WoW. It's functional, if sometimes a bit janky, but has little of the dynamic feel of a game like Guild Wars 2, for example. Even so, it's easy to learn and get into, and there are moments of swinging your lightsaber or launching yourself in the air to rain many rockets down on your enemies that provide a good visceral experience. There's enough to keep the combat from feeling boring, at least in that respect. That does unfortunately lead me to my biggest gripe about the game, however, and that is the lack of challenge. The combat mechanics aren't boring, but the lack of danger is. I've probably played about 50 hours in the last few months since returning to the game, and I've never felt my heart rate increase from a single dangerous fight. Whether it's fighting Sith Lords, getting involved in spaceship dogfights, yes, the game has those, or facing off against a giant wampa like the one that bested Luke, you can keep to a simple rotation of skills and let your companion heal you and win every fight without breaking much of a sweat. I cannot begin to express how much I wish they would adjust the difficulty, because the game would be so much better if they just incorporated a little sense of danger every now and again. I will say as I got deeper into the game, into the expansion stories for example, the game does indeed get harder. It's just a shame that it doesn't happen during the class stories. There are other flaws in the game: graphical glitches, a sometimes clunky user interface, gathering resources visible but unclickable, all minor, but they add up to a less than fully polished experience. The question is whether those things are enough to outweigh the good, and that's something that I think will vary from person to person. Since I value the things the game is good at, most of those flaws are little more than a minor annoyance. And the one big flaw, the lack of difficulty, is not enough to stop my motivation to finish each of these 8 class storylines. That said, if the stories are secondary to you, and you care more about the combat or the graphics, for example, there are going to be plenty of better options out there that are a better use of your time. And that's because, like all MMOs, it takes considerable time to get through the content. If that time is enjoyable, then more time is better. If, however, that time is a bit of a slog, then you're going to have a bad time. Maybe I can offer a solution, though. If you're like me and you really enjoy good storytelling, but don't have the time to focus on an MMO or the interest in playing a game with graphics and mechanics from more than a decade ago, I do offer one possible alternative. As I mentioned earlier, I started a Let's Play featuring the Imperial Agent Sniper class story. I liked the idea of an archetypical agent, humorless and by the book, playing through the whole campaign sticking to that theme. However, it quickly occurred to me that doing a Let's Play of an MMORPG is problematic. Especially for me, because I like to take my time and experience all that a game has to offer without rushing through content and levels, and that can make for some uninteresting content from a video perspective. I think I've solved that problem with a new way of delivering campaign playthroughs, and for anyone interested, there will be full class story and companion cinematic movies up on this channel in the near future, each with a particular theme, starting with the fallen Jedi Knight, who allows his hatred for the murderous Empire to overcome his better judgment until he slips further and further towards the dark side. So I'll be offering the full playthrough of all the class cinematics, the companion cinematics, and the essential combat sequences for some of the classes. I'm determined to finish them all before the game goes away forever. I'm going to start out with the ones I never finished before, and if I don't run out of time, I'll probably go back and do the others just to have them saved and viewable for posterity. I know there are a few other versions of those cinematics already online, and all I'll say to that is that each of mine is going to have the thematic concept that I'll do my best to stick to throughout the playthrough in order to make it as cohesive and interesting a story as possible. I have no idea if they'll get any views, but at least I'll be able to rewatch them myself if I'm ever in the mood to relive that time that my Jedi Knight fought and defeated his first Sith Lord. Just to wrap up, if you're into Star Wars, good storytelling, or just like the idea of swinging a lightsaber around like a space-age samurai, you can do much worse than SWTOR. It is a classic feel game with some flaws and some significant enough strengths that compensate for them, and it's definitely fun if you can focus on those. I'll leave it at that, and thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.